Today on Primetime Politics Weekend, the first ministers meet in Ottawa.
Their share has dropped year after year after year.
The provinces are looking for more healthcare dollars. Ottawa is looking for more accountability and results. What might be accomplished when the premiers and the Prime Minister meet? Also,
it is clear that more time is needed to get this right.
Delaying medically assisted death for the mentally ill. Why is the Trudeau government hoping to push back the inclusion? We will speak with the Federal Justice Minister David Lametti. And
I've always said I was a long shot, so for me to actually get the call was amazing.
She is a respected member of this country's legal community and the first Indigenous person to sit on Canada's Supreme Court. Coming up, a feature interview with the Honourable Justice Michelle Abonsawin. This is Primetime Politics Weekend. Well, the federal government is backing down, withdrawing controversial amendments from its signature gun bill. Now, the amendments came late in the process and were criticized by many as targeting rifles and shotguns used by hunters and farmers. The Liberals said it was about banning assault-style weapons, but now Bill C-21 will move forward without those amendments.
What we acknowledge today is there was insufficient consultation, that more work had to be done to hear from Indigenous communities and from Canadians across the board. It is absolutely critical that this bill get adopted. It's important that we take handguns off our streets and assault-style weapons. And there's a couple of items that we still need to have conversations about.
Meanwhile, the Conservative leader is declaring a temporary victory, while the NDP is glad to move on with the bill with its original focus on handguns.
Today's humiliating climb down that we have forced Trudeau to make is a temporary pause in his plan to ban hunting rifles. He is doing this because he got caught, and because Canadians of all walks of life from across the country, law-abiding, decent, Indigenous Canadians, farmers, rural Canadians who follow the law, stood up with Conservatives and forced him to temporarily pause this plan.
You know, I don't know what reasoning the Liberals ultimately had for these amendments, but I definitely will underline the incompetence part of it. When those amendments were dropped, they single-handedly derailed any kind of progress we were making on the bill. And now that they are gone, we can begin to work on the more constructive elements of C-21.
With their thoughts, we're now joined by our Friday journalist panel. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Catherine Lévesque is parliamentary reporter with the National Post. Nice to see both of you in studio.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Happy to have you here. So listen, Catherine, I'll get you to start. You know, here you have the Liberals pulling back on these amendments, but did they really have any other choice? You know, the opposition to them built up very quickly, and they crossed party lines.
I mean, they had to do something. They had to pull it out. It was becoming too much of a contentious issue. But they also saw the opposition growing from the Conservatives to the NDP to even the Bloc. So I think, you know, something changed since Christmas. They saw the polls. I think they saw the numbers. The numbers are not very good for the Liberals right now, and so they had to do something to buy the peace, to kind of pull this issue out of the public sphere, and to move on with their bill, their proposed bill, and to buy the peace with the NDP especially. Now, I expect the Conservatives to kind of still go on about this issue to try to kill the bill, but ultimately, I think they had to retrieve those amendments. They didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm. You know, Bob, were the Liberals overconfident here? Because, yeah, as we said, these amendments came late in the game. Did they not anticipate the pushback?
Look, they were trying to wedge the Conservatives. Pierre Poilievre had just become leader. Let's wedge them on guns, because they did so effectively against Aaron O'Toole in the 2021 election campaign. But they didn't do their homework. They went after guns that are used by people who hunt, by people who are farmers, and most importantly, the Indigenous community who use these kind of rifles to go hunting for a variety of things. It blew up in their faces because somebody in Ottawa who doesn't know anything about hunting or Indigenous life or the kind of guns that are used responsibly in hunting thought, oh, let's wedge the Tories and let's put these guns in, and it blew up in their faces. Yes, the Tories went after them hard, but boy, when I saw, the NDP MPs from Northern Ontario, like Charlie Angus, come out and say, I'm against this, this is really bad, you knew that this was, they could not sustain this. So they got hosted by their own petard, if I want to say so, and now we're going to get back to the original intention of the legislation, which I don't think there's any disagreement, handguns.
Okay, well, pick up on that point then, Catherine. Will this now pass quickly? Will C-21 actually get passed quickly now that these amendments are gone?
I don't think so, because as Mark Collins said, I mean, they're going to be consulting now. They're going back to the consultations. I know the opposition just before Christmas, actually, in the committee, they were talking about consulting and actually doing a cross-country tour, going in northern areas, going to meet with Indigenous communities to actually talk about this bill. So I get the feeling that there's still going to be this consultation happening. But, ultimately, I do think this bill, if there are no more controversial amendments, I think it's going to pass, because certainly I think the NDP said they were okay with it. Now I think the Bloc will also want to support it ultimately.
Which brings me to what they were trying to do with the amendments, Bob, because, to listen to the Conservative leader, he says this is just a temporary reprieve. He expects the Liberals to come back, again, warning hunters and Indigenous populations about the amendments. So what do you make of the future of those intents?
I don't think that they've learned their lesson here. They've got their fingertips burned on the stove. They're not going to bring back banning of guns that are used by people who hunt or fish or Indigenous people. But there are obviously rifles that are used for hunting that look like machine guns or out of Rambo, and I don't think the Tories want to defend those rifles. Good luck, because people in the country take a look at some of those guns and they go, whoa, that doesn't look like a hunting rifle to me. That looks like a rifle you go into a shopping mall and kill people. So they'll be successful if they bring those kind of amendments in, but they just have to be really careful that there is a law-abiding segment of the Canadian population that hunt and fish, and they need guns for if they're on farms or in remote communities, or if they're Indigenous, which is crucial to their life. They need those kind of weapons, and they have to think that through.
Okay, well, let's shift focus now and talk about Tuesday, because, of course, next Tuesday, the First Ministers will gather here in Ottawa. Healthcare funding, of course, on the table. What do you expect out of that meeting, Catherine? Are we looking at a wholesale deal here on healthcare funding? Are we looking at sideline agreements? What do you think will come out of that meeting?
I think we're going to be talking about numbers. That's really the crux of this whole thing right now. I know this week the premiers came out and said we expect healthcare to be funded by 35%. That means $28 billion extra dollars every year. I don't think they're going to be getting that. I think, they wish they could have that, but I don't think that's going to be happening. But we also saw the premiers complain a little bit about the fact that they haven't had any proposal yet from the federal government. So I expect the federal government to try to come there with numbers, to try to talk about this, but also get them to try to agree to conditions. And ultimately, I think we might actually see some separate deals with different provinces, because, right now there's still this unity between the premiers, but as we've seen in the past, this can quickly disappear.
Yeah, well, of course, in November, the health ministers came together with the federal government. Nothing came of that. What's your expectation for Tuesday?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of money on the table, but all of it is not going to be part of the Canada Health Transfer. A big chunk, I don't know how much, but there will be a significant amount of money that will go to bilateral agreements, because every province has particular interest. In the case of Ontario, for example, they're talking a 10-year deal with $70 billion on the table. Some of it obviously in Canada Health Transfer, but the other in terms of building long-term care facilities and home care. Every province has, people in the Yukon and Northwest Territories or British Columbia have different medical needs. So these bilateral agreements are going to have to be negotiated. But there's going to be agreement. The Prime Minister is not meeting with the First Ministers to walk away without failure. And there has been some significant concessions made from the premiers, including the Premier of Quebec, in terms of data modernization so that doctors can access your health records, or you can access your health records. Mental health, money for mental health. There's the fact that we're going to reduce credentials. They are agreeing to reduce credentials so people can move from one province to another if they need as a nurse or a doctor. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and that's because Ottawa has held out a lot of money, and the provinces have started to say, okay, maybe we can agree to this. Yeah,
that's interesting, though, because you say a lot of money, and this picks up on your point, because here you do have the provinces. They want billions of dollars more, but there are, I guess, two competing interests here for the federal government. On the one hand, how much wiggle room do they actually have fiscally, considering that we heard Chrystia Freeland already warn that there's not a lot of money left. But what is the political price they pay if they don't cough up some money to meet the healthcare needs, given the crisis, the different crises that we're seeing right across the country?
They have to cough up some money. I think, if they're going to be using any money in the next budget, is going to be for healthcare, but also to, for electric vehicles, to, respond to the United States Inflation Reduction Act. But certainly for healthcare, they have to do something. But at the same time, they expect to have results in the medium term, in the long term. The federal government, I think, rightly so, doesn't want to give billions extra in money just to have premiers give that back in checks or, in tax breaks for their citizens. So, of course, they have to give some money, but again, I really do not think it's going to be an extra $28 billion per year. Jean-Yves Duclos has already said, well, look, we're already giving some extra money. That's because it's following inflation and the current transfer. For this year, I think it's $49 billion, so that is a significant amount. But yes, I do expect some more money for some long-term investments and results.
But there's no room for failure here.
Yeah. The Liberals campaign on health care, right?
Yeah,
they distinguish themselves
not just
on that.
I mean, the premiers are responsible for health care. Ottawa does provide a significant amount of funding. But, the Canadians, the healthcare system is on the verge of collapse here. And if they walk out of a meeting with failure, people are going to be out in the streets with pitchforks against both the federal government and the provinces. So they've got to come out of this meeting saying, we're going to fix this. It's not going to happen overnight. Clearly, it's going to take over a period of time, but we are committed to doing so.
Yeah, millions of Canadians without a primary care doctor, people watching this very closely across the country, as will we come Tuesday. But for now, Bob, Catherine, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Staying on health care, over the holiday break, the Ontario government announced it would be funding more procedures at private clinics. This to address the backlog of surgeries in the province. And when Parliament returned this past week, that move was a major focus for the federal NDP leader. Jagmeet Singh saying he is worried about for-profit care and the precedent the Ontario government is setting. He's also worried about the impact private clinics will have on a public system already struggling to find new doctors and nurses. Earlier this week, we did speak to Dr. Jane Philpott about the concern. Dr. Philpott is a former Trudeau health minister and now Dean for Health Sciences at Queen's University. She also co-authored a report released last month from the Public Policy Forum called Taking Back Healthcare. Dr. Philpott, nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So a lot to talk about here, but I do want to begin with the concern being expressed by Mr. Singh. Do you have concerns about provinces using public dollars to fund private healthcare delivery?
Well, in fact, this is one of the matters that is addressed in our report, the Public Policy Forum report, where we speak about the fact that in many ways this becomes a bit of a red herring, this conversation around private delivery of care. The reality is that an enormous amount of care is already delivered privately. For example, most family doctors across the country are private practitioners and run their own private corporations, but they're publicly funded. And so it's important to make sure that when we're talking about private care, the concern comes in private pay. We don't want to see people being able to jump the queue by paying separately outside of health insurance for medically necessary care. So unfortunately, it becomes a bit of a distraction and as part of the conversation Mr. Singh is correct that, of course, one of the challenges is the health workforce. And so often, you can build extra private facilities, but if you don't have the doctors and nurses to staff them, that's where the problem lies, not necessarily the fact that it's private delivery of care, but that in fact we have a very serious health workforce crisis.
Mm-hmm. And underline the word crisis there, because you say that, and I think it's fair to say the Canadians really do take great pride in national health care. And I think about the debate in the United States over Obamacare, when Canada was held up as a model of what a single payer system could create and look like. But I'm wondering, is that pride now misplaced? Because here we have millions of Canadians not even having a primary care provider anymore.
Well, the shortage of access to family doctors or other primary care providers is an extremely serious issue. And to your question about whether or not Canadians' pride is misplaced, of course, we ought to be extremely proud of the fact that we do have universal coverage of health insurance for Canadians, and that they are by law allowed to have access to medically necessary care funded by that insurance, not funded by out-of-pocket payment. However, there are lots of things that don't fit into that system. There are lots of things like sometimes home care, mental health care, for example, for which there is not a publicly insured way to be able to get access to that care. And as you've mentioned, we have a big problem in the way that primary care has been designed across the country, and so that health workforce shortage requires a real realignment of primary care and a big emphasis on making sure that Canadians do have that access.
Oh, okay. Let's go into that a bit deeper then, because I do wonder what is needed to restore Canadian pride, faith for that matter, in the public health care system. What would it actually look like in future if the current, or at least the past model, is not what's working anymore?
Well, let me speak to what we think it could look like. And this is, again, something that we talk about in the report, where we advocate for the concept of every Canadian having access to a primary care health team. We believe that team-based care is a big part of the solution to the health workforce crisis, knowing that when people need access to care, it may not necessarily be a doctor they need to see. They may be able to see a nurse practitioner or a dietitian or a social worker to have their care needs met. But that just like we fund public schools for every Canadian child when they need to get access to school, every Canadian should be able to have access in their community, ideally within a half an hour's drive of home, to be able to go and see a primary care team. And we believe that that is doable.
Okay, doable. But, you noted yourself in the report, there have been recommendations in the past. It's been a stop and start kind of I guess, response to these requests and recommendations. What makes this time different? Here is this report. Obviously, the healthcare system right now is in crisis. But what makes this time different that makes you believe that politicians and leaders may actually be listening to what you're recommending?
Well, I think that the public has really been pushed beyond their point of patience. And so the report is called Taking Back Healthcare, and it speaks to the fact that this is the people's healthcare system or systems, and that people need to step up and demand and let their policymakers and decision makers at all orders of government be clear about what the expectations of Canadians are, that we have been proud in the past, but we're very much at risk. The system is in deeper crisis than it has been in our lifetimes, and it's time for people to step up and say, we expect you to get on with it, to rearrange our healthcare system so that we'll be able to get good value for the very large investments that Canadians make in having that healthcare system be there for them.
Now, we are expecting some kind of federal-provincial deal on healthcare next week. The provinces, as you know, asking for more money, the federal government asking for more accountability and data as well. What will you be looking for in that deal? What would signal to you an understanding of a way to address the crisis that we're in right now?
Well, you've spoken to some of the things that people are certainly expecting. We're expecting that the federal government is likely to make further investments in healthcare, that there are likely to be some kind of conditions attached to that. Certainly the data issue is one that the report speaks to, and there's a huge challenge around interoperability and access to data to support health systems and patient care. But I'm hoping that we're also going to see investments in the workforce. I'm part of Queen's University's Faculty of Health Sciences, where we train nurses and doctors, and we know that we need to be training more, and other universities like our own are prepared to be able to expand our programs, but that will require investment. And of course, a real restructuring of care so that people will get access, so those millions of Canadians who don't have a family doctor will be able to get the care they need. It has to happen now.
Dr. Jane Philpott, really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Medical assistance in dying. It's otherwise known as MAID, and it has been legal in this country since 2016. Now, while it was reserved for people whose deaths were, quote, reasonably foreseeable, the criteria has expanded. In fact, by next month, it would have been allowed on the grounds of mental disorder alone, but the federal government has introduced a bill to delay that. Without this bill, MAID would be available to the mentally ill on March the 17th. But if it passes, the inclusion for mental illness would be pushed back to March 17 of 2024. To discuss the reasons for this, we're now joined by the Federal Justice Minister, David Lametti. Minister, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, there appears to be several reasons for this delay, but I'm wondering if in any way it signals a hesitation about extending MAID to include the mentally ill.
No, it's not a hesitation to including. It is more a recognition of the complexity of it, and the fact that I think more people, more experts, more practitioners, as well as Canadians generally, need to internalize the standards that are going to be there. This is incredibly complex. This isn't the case. Let me underline that this isn't the case of somebody who is depressed or has suicidal ideations, going to a doctor and saying, I want MAID. It is, those people must and should reach out for help, because those kinds of conditions are eminently treatable. And as a society, we need to put more work into that. This is the case of long-standing mental disorders, conditions of mental illness that are being treated by doctors, where a person after that period of time with their doctor doesn't want to continue, and we have to be empathetic to that situation and recognize that. So it is a very rare set of cases. We have a good experts report that is going to frame all of this, but some provinces, some experts, some universities, practitioners said they needed more time. We're giving them more time.
Giving them more time. And, I do want to talk a little bit about the criteria of this when it comes to mental disorders. But, you did say during the news conference today that you could have gone with the original deadline. And I appreciate you say some want more time. But if you could have gone with the original deadline, considering there is a demand for this, why delay it? Why not just go forward in 6 weeks' time?
Well, it is a matter, I think, of making sure that as many people as possible can be ready, that as many people as possible are comfortable with the standards, particularly practitioners who have to make the diagnoses and understand them. We had a pandemic, we had COVID, that slowed the process down for a number of provinces. There's a great deal of heightened rhetoric around this, a great deal of it very much misleading. And so we're combating all of that. We think this is the prudent way to move forward. We need people to understand what is happening. We need people to understand what's not happening. And a prudent step-by-step approach is really the best way, we think, for everybody involved to move forward.
Well, I want to pick up on the opposition that you're referencing there, because we did hear from, or at least see from, Conservative MP Michael Cooper, who went on social media today, described the inclusion of mental disorders as a dangerous expansion of MAID, and says it should just be scrapped altogether, this expansion of the definition who can access it. How do you react to that?
Well, I think I obviously disagree with Mr. Cooper. I don't think, first of all, I think that this is an incremental expansion. It is not going to apply to that many cases. We're talking about the vast majority of MAID cases are still end of life.
And a very small percentage of those cases are not end of life. And this is a small percentage of cases within that small percentage of cases. So we're not talking about that many people. It's very much incremental. And what I think we need to realize is that mental illness is an illness. And people who are suffering from mental disorders are suffering from mental disorders. And if they have tried all available treatments with their doctor, they, like any other Canadian, have a right to ask for MAID. It is something that we recognize as a moral imperative. It's something that the courts have recognized. The ability to ask for MAID has been recognized in a general way in the Carter decision. And Canadians with mental illness are like any other Canadian. If they are capable of making that decision and fall within the criteria, then we believe they should have access to it. Now, these are difficult decisions. These are heartbreaking decisions. I understand that. But this is about autonomous choice and about securing the ability for people to make those autonomous choices within a safe and secure system.
I'm wondering, Minister, how much of that evidence, though, is anecdotal versus actual statistical numbers? Because, you know, even before the law was passed in 2016, I think it's fair to say that for many, the idea of MAID would only be applied to the terminally ill. But now, as you know, the fears that you said yourself are being expressed that it might be available to any adult who just has suicidal thoughts. What would you say to that? Are there numbers to back up what you're saying, or is this just anecdotal?
Well, I think sadly, the anecdotes are coming from those critical of what we're doing. First of all, let me underline again that somebody with suicidal thoughts is not eligible for MAID according to the criteria. That is not the case. These are serious and long-standing mental disorders, and the expert committee took great pains to underline that. So I really need to emphasize that, because that's one of the pieces of misinformation that's being peddled by the opposition here. The statistical picture is getting better. In fact, part of Bill C-7, which were the 2021 reforms, was precisely to gather better data from the provinces, disaggregated data, who's seeking MAID, how many times it's being administered, and to whom, under what circumstances. That picture is already better since the 7th of January, and we're going to continue to build that picture as we move forward. And this will be particularly helpful in those non-end-of-life cases. Again, the minority of cases, but it is important to have a better picture. And this will help us as we move forward. We're basing the decision on evidence and not anecdote, and I think it is fair to say that we are pushing this forward prudently, at an appropriate pace, and I think for the benefit of Canadians.
Now, you introduced the bill today. Again, if passed, it would delay the deadline that you face. But, you know, the original deadline is still March 17th. Will you be able to get your bill passed before that?
Well, we think we can. We know we have the support of the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. The Conservative Party, when I appeared before them in committee, grilled me rather vigorously, asking me for an extension. I hope that they will now be true to their word and support this extension, because it is precisely what they were asking for at the end of 2022.
Minister David Lametti, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
After weeks of having his name thrown around by opposition MPs, Dominic Barton got his say on the Hill, appearing before the Government Operations Committee on Wednesday to answer allegations his relationship with the Prime Minister helped McKinsey Company gain government contracts worth over $100 million. Barton was the global director for McKinsey for 9 years before becoming Canada's ambassador to China.
I know what the relationship is with the Prime Minister, and I'm telling you that. It was a professional relationship, and I'm honestly quite shocked at what I'm reading about in the papers. It's incredible. He must find it incredible, because it's just simply not true. It was a professional relationship. There was respect. There were always people in the room, and that's what it was.
Well, to discuss the impact of that testimony and other matters that have dominated this first week of Parliament for 2023, let's reach out now to our political observers. Susan Smith is principal for the Blue Sky Strategy Group. Sean Murphy is a senior consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies. And Peggy Nash is a former NDP member of Parliament and now senior advisor at Toronto Metropolitan University. Hello to the three of you.
Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Susan, I'm going to get you to start us off here. You know, we were all watching Mr. Barton's testimony very closely yesterday. What did you make of it?
Well, he's a thoughtful person, obviously. It's very clear that he's been not part of McKinsey for more than 3.5 years. He divested of his shares. He's not involved in the business operations at all. And it was also apparent that it was a bit of a witch hunt, I think. They're trying, instead of the committee doing good work so far and examining why the public service is reaching out for so many external consultant contracts, they seem to be zeroing in just on McKinsey. They think because there's a political fire there, perhaps. I think the smart thing that Mr. Barton suggested, and others, I believe the NDP suggested, and Peggy, you'll probably talk about this, is that the committee study the broader question of why the public service is reaching out so much for external consultant help. Is it a lack of capacity? Is it speed? Was it COVID that caused so much of this to take place? And that to me was the big takeaway on the committee. Why isn't the committee doing a bigger, broader job that's kind of more beneficial to Canadians on that front?
Mm-hmm. Sean, I'll get you to pick it up because it has been, to Susan's point, it has been Conservatives who've been using Mr. Barton's name, tying it to these government contracts. I'm wondering, from your vantage point, did his testimony diminish the case that's being made, the point that's being made by Conservative politicians?
I don't think it diminishes the point at all. I watched his testimony yesterday, and I was struck that somebody who has been lauded for having such a profound depth of knowledge and such a stellar contact list seemed to know nothing and seemed to know no one as this was all going on. But his testimony yesterday, he tended to plead ignorance on all these things, and I think that's up for the committee to decide whether they take him at his word on whether or not he knew what was going on. I think there are still very important questions that remain on why it is that the government would choose to do so much business, over $100 million worth of business, with a company that has been involved in so many of these scandals. You think of having to pay settlements for their role in advising Purdue Pharma on how to turbocharge sales of OxyContin and turbocharge the opioid crisis, on how McKinsey had held corporate retreats next to a concentration camp in China. So the questions remain, why would the government want to do so much business with a company like this? So whatever you thought of Mr. Barton's testimony yesterday, it does not end with Mr. Barton. There are still plenty of questions and plenty for this committee to dig into.
Peggy, what did you make of it?
Well, I thought Dominic Barton was very skillful at delivering the message that the buck didn't stop with him, that even though when he was the head of this global corporation, he really didn't know in a deep way what was going on in many of the files, and that there was really nothing for the public or the committee to see in terms of personal relationships with the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister, when it seemed to the public that, in fact, they did have a closer relationship. But be that as it may, I think there's a valid point, two valid points. One is around why have so much contracting out in general, and Gord Johns, the NDP member of the committee, was pushing for a broader examination. But I also have to agree, why McKinsey? They have such a bad reputation around the world, whether it's in France with the Macron government, the South African government, the Saudis, obviously around Purdue Pharma and the conflict of interest because they were also advising the Food and Drug Administration. So I think there are serious questions about why the government went to McKinsey, and perhaps it's up to the government to answer that. But secondly, I think that I agree, the bigger question is why so much contracting out? You certainly have less public scrutiny when private contractors are performing the work. Was that part of the reason? Will we know what advice was being specifically given, and was that advice taken? I think these are questions that really only the government will be able to answer.
Well, that's interesting. And Susan, I'll bring you back in here because we did hear from a Carleton University prof, Amanda Clark, on Monday. And she was describing the whole McKinsey affair as being a distraction to the larger issue that there are so many public contracts going out to private consultants. I'm wondering, given this controversy, do you think it's going to change the way government does business going forward?
I don't know, Michael. It depends what the outcome is. It depends if there's a proper if the committee does a proper study, and instead of just going after one company, that they take a bigger step back, they act more like adults and look at the overall contracting issue, trying to understand where the gaps are. PSPC, Public Works and Procurement Canada, I'll get the acronym wrong in a moment, has a very rigorous process for any company that's trying to do work with government. I think there'll probably be some scrutiny on that process, and I think they'll probably find that it is rigorous, and that companies are chosen hopefully for best value, but also for best advice that they're able to give. We have a talented public service, but it does not do everything. It does not have the latest insight, intel, or action plan necessarily on what the best way is to do stuff. So I think it's smart to a certain extent and appropriately for governments to reach out for insights and advice. But are they doing it the right way? Are they spending too much or not enough money on that? That is something the committee could look at if it was doing its job properly. And maybe it's something the Auditor General eventually looks at as well.
Sean, what do you think? Do you think business will change going forward?
Well, I'd say, look, clearly there's plenty of knowledge and expertise that exists outside the public service. So it's not shocking that the government would tap into that when they need to. But the question of whether or not the question of going forward, doing the analysis of the value for money that the government is getting out of all of these different consultants that they're hiring, that's fair enough. That investigation ought to happen, and that study ought to continue. But it's not just a question of value; it's a question of values, plural, and whether or not the government ought to be tying itself or doing so much business with a company like McKinsey, which has had so many of these scandals that Peggy listed off. I don't recall ever hearing about Deloitte having a corporate retreat next to a concentration camp, and I don't think PricewaterhouseCoopers has had the same issues with the way the way McKinsey helped to turbocharge the opioid crisis. So it is a question of value for dollars, sure, for the Canadian taxpayer, but it's also a question of values and whether we want to be associating the brand of Canada with the brand of McKinsey.
Yeah, and I think that is where we're going to see the arguments go next. But, you know, Peggy, you're talking about transparency, and Susan was talking about the public service. And when we were listening to Dominic Barton yesterday, he said part of the reason why governments turn to consultants is because the public service does not have the capacity or the knowledge base to address certain issues. And he says if things are to change, then the federal government really has to build capacity within the civil service. How do you respond to that?
Well, there probably are situations where the public service may not have the expertise, whether it's technical expertise or whatever. But, you know, we've heard from public servants who said that some of the advice that these public consultants were giving was so anodyne, so basic that it really was of no value. And I think sometimes there is a mentality in governments, more conservative-leaning governments, small c conservative governments, that the private sector always does it better, that public servants are too slow or they don't have the expertise. And I challenge that. I think we have an excellent public service. My experience with them as a parliamentarian was that they were impressive. And if they're saying they can do the job, I don't know why we have not used them more. France, when they conducted a similar inquiry after a large scandal, found that they were way, way overusing consultants. And it was just the default by many French politicians. I think we need to value our public service, occasionally supplement them where there are certain additions needed. But we have to be very careful about value for money, the cost of these things, and the public accountability. If we can't know how our public dollars are being spent, what advice is being given, what advice is being taken, then I think there is a real smokescreen and a danger to using a greater number of public consultants.
Okay, well, listen to the three of you. I'm going to end it there for this week. I was hoping to talk about healthcare given the First Minister's meeting on Tuesday, but of course we have time to do that next week. But for now, Susan, Sean, Peggy, really appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Michelle O'Bonsawin made history last September when she became the first Indigenous person appointed to sit on the Supreme Court of Canada. But Justice O'Bonsawin was a trailblazer long before her nomination. She is an accomplished jurist and legal scholar, educator, and a champion for mental health. She earned a master's and a PhD, all while working full-time and raising her two boys. In 2017, she became the first Indigenous justice named to Ontario Superior Court. But as one of Canada's brightest legal minds, Justice O'Bonsawin doesn't want to be just a token Indigenous judge. And recently, I did sit down for a more personal conversation with Michelle O'Bonsawin. Madam Justice, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
I want to begin with a simple question, because your life seems to have changed so drastically, so quickly. Are you adjusting?
I am. It has been an adjustment, I can't lie. The last 3 months are a bit of a whirlwind, actually. Yeah.
And what was that like? I can't imagine what it would be like for someone to reach out to say that you're being considered, and then to get a subsequent phone call to say, oh, you have the job. What was that like?
It was surreal because you always hope, but I've always said I was a long shot. So for me to actually get the call was amazing because that little hope was inside, and then it came a reality. It was surreal.
It's interesting for you to say that you thought you were a long shot, because I think once people saw the nomination, many people just nodded their head. It makes perfect sense. Why did you think you were a long shot?
Well, I know a lot of people always think that the regular trajectory is you've either worked in a larger firm or you've gone to the Court of Appeal. I've always worked my whole career in-house, and I know that from my understanding, no one has ever sat on the Supreme Court that worked like me, always in-house as a litigator. So that was something very different. And then afterwards, I didn't sit on the Court of Appeal. So it was a leapfrog that I thought I could do, but I wasn't sure if others believed that too.
Well, I do want to ask about that, this internal belief, because when you were speaking to the parliamentarians taking part in the question and answer period, you were very clear. You said from a young age, as a little girl, you had dreamed of becoming a lawyer. But did you ever dream of ascending to such a big position?
I had always wanted to be a lawyer. That was a done deal. When I was 9, I had decided that. To be a judge, really, it started to be a possibility or a thought. When I was in my first year of law school, we had someone from the commissioner's office come in our class of legislation, talk to us to explain how do you become a judge. So you had to be a lawyer at least 10 years, you had to have a good reputation. And someone asked him, so what's the perfect judge? And he said, well, it's a bilingual Aboriginal woman. I thought, hey, that's me. And then all of a sudden I thought, wow, why didn't I think of this before? I could actually do that. I could one day aspire to be a judge. And then the dream just started from there.
Why didn't you think of it before, do you think?
I don't know, like I come from very modest means, so my family was not a family of professionals, of lawyers and doctors, etc. My dad was a head machinist at Inco, my mom was a teacher, my dad's brothers all worked at Inco, and so when you come from that background, it's not necessarily something you think. And when I had said to my guidance counselor that I wanted to be a lawyer, he told me, Michelle, you know, think about it twice, because you come from a small town in Northern Ontario. It's likely not going to happen. And that's when I thought, well, listen, watch me go, because this is going to happen. I'm going to make it happen. But being a judge, that was at another level.
Yeah. Well, what is the reaction then in your hometown of Hamner, in Sudbury, Ontario, your family? How are they reacting to all of this?
They're ecstatic, and I laugh because every once in a while a cousin or my aunt will say, oh my God, someone asked me if we're related, because they know that, you know, we have the same name, or so they're really proud.
Now, really proud, and that makes sense because without a doubt, you're a trailblazer. You are the first Indigenous person to sit in the Supreme Court. You're an Indigenous woman, Franco-Ontarian. But in that same question and answer period that you took part in with parliamentarians, you're very clear, despite all those modifiers and the elements of who you are first and foremost a judge.
Absolutely.
Why that distinction?
It's important because when you're a judge, you're impartial. And there can't be the perception that because you're Indigenous, you're going to go a certain way when you hear Indigenous matters. If you're a brown person, you're going to hear matters a certain way and make a certain decision. So just because we have unique backgrounds doesn't make us predisposed to make a decision in a certain fashion. You make a decision based on the case that's put forward in front of you. So that's why it was important for me to say I am a judge first. I am, of course, all these other things, and it'll nourish my perspective, but it's not an absolute.
It's that double standard, isn't it, though? Because if you are a man, if you are of European background, these are perhaps considerations that wouldn't come to people's minds.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree.
Yeah. So does it make you uncomfortable then when people do describe you as a trailblazer, when they praise you for the glass ceilings that you're breaking by taking on this role?
I understand why some say that, but then I want people to know too that I hope they don't have the perception that I'm only at the Supreme Court because I'm an Indigenous person. I worked 17 years as an in-house litigator. I appeared at different levels of tribunals and courts. I did my master's and my PhD while working full-time first as a lawyer, then afterwards sitting on the Superior Court of Justice for 5 years, and while doing my PhD full-time. So I think I bring more than just being an Indigenous woman.
Do you feel the pressure of it, though, because you are still an Indigenous woman?
Mm-hmm.
You are a jurist. You now sit in the top court in this country. You're still an Indigenous woman. Do you feel any pressure from the community on that level?
I think it's just normal, right? People want to see themselves reflected on the court, and they're hoping that their point of views are going to be brought through that person. So, of course, there's always that weight, and you live under the microscope, but I've always said I have wide shoulders, and that's fine.
So where does your indigeneity fit in? How does it fit into your work now and your work in the past?
In the past, it was very much a part of me under the 94 calls to action from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was really important to have that aspect of education about Indigenous issues, and I took that to heart because there's two components that are amongst others. There's education and justice. So I had my own personal mandate to educate as many jurists and lawyers, people in the legal field, about GLADU principles, how they work, how we have high incarceration rates, how Indigenous people are impacted, their mental health is impacted by intergenerational trauma and direct trauma related to residential schools. So I thought that was very important, and I took that to heart, and I did that during my legal career as a lawyer. But I did also continue that also as a jurist, because I think it's important for colleagues who are sentencing Indigenous people to know what GLADU principles are, how they work, and what the roles and responsibilities are of every person in that courtroom. So the judge has obligations, as noted by the GLADU and IPELI Supreme Court of Canada decisions, but also the lawyers that appear there, the different workers, the social workers, all those that work in the criminal justice system. Everyone has a role to play.
Mm-hmm. So how will that guide you, the GLADU principle? How will that factor into the work you do here in the Supreme Court?
I think it's an added knowledge that I have. It's an expertise that I've really worked on in the past 20 years throughout my career. So I think any knowledge that we have in addition to just our regular base as jurists is always beneficial.
Mm-hmm. You're not yet 50. Mandatory retirement for a Supreme Court judge is 75. You have the opportunity to spend some time in this court to influence, to contribute to Canadian society in a way that others don't. At this point, what do you hope your contribution will be?
I hope my contribution is just going to bring that unique perspective as an Indigenous person, a Franco-Ontarian from a small town. These are things that are part of my identity. And to bring that to this court, and I'm hoping to be known as a hardworking judge, someone who's just, who listens well and also writes thoughtful decisions.
Mm-hmm. Now the court is slowly starting to truly reflect what Canadian society looks like. How important is that, do you think?
I think it's important because everyone, as part of society, wants to see public institutions or see themselves actually in public institutions. And the Supreme Court is part of that process, right? We're part of those institutions. So for us to have diversity on our court is really important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are there any challenges you hope the court takes on in your time here?
That's a good question. I don't know if there are things specific.
You think so.
I wouldn't say there are things specific because we have all kinds of interesting issues that are going to be coming in front of this court. We have issues on climate change, I'm sure, environmental issues, Indigenous issues, human rights, privacy. Like there are so many interesting issues that this court deals with, and I think it's going to be an interesting 20-plus years for me at this court.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And your appointment, of course, a huge acknowledgement of all that you have accomplished. And really, I don't know where you find the time. You're a jurist. You are a doctor of laws. You are a spouse, a mother. You have 3 dogs, 9 chickens, and a gecko. Again, I don't know how you do it. Does that reality say anything about your desire to always be engaged?
I think that it shows that I'm hardworking, and you know what's beneficial? I don't sleep a lot, so I'm able to do all these things.
What's your average sleep time?
4 to 5 hours of consecutive sleep, I think, is a good night.
Good for you. I don't know how you do it. Your appointment also comes at a time, you referenced it, that this country is starting this path of reconciliation, and really just starting. Do you think about the history that's being made by your appointment? Do you think about the influence your appointment will have on young girls across the country, on Indigenous youth across the country?
I'm hoping it will inspire them because not everyone comes from a big city. A lot of people come from remote areas, and for them to know that it's a possibility. If you dream big and work hard, you can get there. It's a possibility. If I did it, I think anyone else can too.
Mm-hmm. Have you gone back to your hometown since the appointment was announced?
I have. It's been great, I have to say. I've seen friends, I've seen different people who I worked with in the past, tons of family members, and yeah, everyone's rejoicing. We're all happy.
That's good to hear. I think it's fair to say that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, mm-hmm. Be they parents, grandparents, ancestors, mentors, people who blazed the path forward to begin with, who fought for the right to be acknowledged and for the right to succeed. Mm-hmm. Whose shoulders do you stand on?
I have been very fortunate that in the past few years I've stood on the shoulders of giants like Murray Sinclair, Phil Fontaine. They've been a huge influence on me. I've also had the great mentorship of Justice Charles Hackland, who was on my court prior to my arrival here. He was actually the first judge who called me when the news came out that I had been appointed to the Superior Court to remind me that when I had applied to the court, he was one of my references. He said, don't forget, I offered my mentorship, and I think that his mentorship made me the judge I am today, actually.
How so?
He taught me how to be respectful, to listen when you have parties that appear in front of you, because their stories are really important to them. And for us, it's not about just giving our opinion, it's to listen to their stories and then interpret the law and apply the law to it. But I think being respectful, and one of the things that's really important is to be a good, clear, concise writer. And I think that those are really valuable things that I've learned from them.
You mentioned clear, concise writing, and it makes me think about the first decision that you'll one day, right? How daunting is that idea?
It's very daunting. And I have to say, though, I feel a bit more zen about it as I'm in my 3rd month, because I'm really surrounded by brilliant people. And a lot of my colleagues have really said, you know, if you have questions, come and see me. If there are things that you want to bounce off of us. So I feel really well surrounded on that aspect. And I don't feel really afraid to ask questions, because I've always thought I'm going to learn by asking questions at times, and I feel comfortable to do that even here.
Mm-hmm. What was that first day like here? Did it feel like the first day of school, being back, you know, here you are, this accomplished jurist, but you must feel like a little girl again in such a grand room in front of people who play such an important role in this country?
It's amazing, and I have to say, my adventure started off on a different foot. Like Justice Cassiera, for example, started off in Winnipeg. I started off in Quebec City. So it was a different environment because we were sitting in the Court of Appeal there. And I remember at the back, we took a little picture of a few of us together in preparation for my first day. And I remember when the door opened and they called La Cour and we walked in, I have that sense of pride. And then when it was here, and I point here in back of us, when the double doors open and you hear La Cour, like, this is something you see on TV. It's not necessarily something you're a part of. Whereas here it was something different. I was actually a part of that court now. So to walk in after hearing that, to take my place amongst the 9 others, I felt a huge sense of pride. And I was emotional. I actually got a bit teary-eyed when those doors first opened and I walked in. It was marvelous.
I talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. You're a mother of 2 sons. What do you hope they take away from your experience and your journey?
I hope they're going to be proud. I hope they're going to learn that you always persevere and start what you finish. Because, for example, when I started off my PhD, I had started off as a lawyer. And then I took 2 years off to learn how to be a good judge in the Superior Court. And I went back to it. And one of the reasons I went back to it is I really wanted to show my sons that when you start something, persevere. It's not always going to be difficult. It's not always going to be easy, but you're going to get there. And it was important to show them that path. So I hope that they learn that. And they learn that from myself, from having made mistakes, for them to know that it's not fatal. You get up again, you keep walking, and you persevere. So I hope that some of my values that I'm trying to show them is going to impact and stay with them.
Mm-hmm. Along with 3 dogs, 9 chickens, and a gecko.
Yeah, that too.
Oh, by the way, you also talked about getting a cat to add to the coterie of pets.
I did, but I have to say, since that time, we've had further family discussions, and I think instead of getting the cat, I'm trying to convince him now to get a 4th dog, so stay tuned.
Maybe one day he'll be in court with you.
That's right, you never know.
Thank you so much for the time, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Ulini.
And that is our program this weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.